For centuries, people have been taught to look for power in obvious places. Kings on thrones, armies on battlefields, flags raised over conquered lands. But some of the most influential forces in history operated quietly, without uniforms, crowns, or swords. They had no king, no capital, no standing army. Yet they shaped economies, controlled markets, punished rulers, and decided which cities would rise and which would slowly disappear. Welcome to Wealthime Archive. If you care about history, money, and power, like this video and subscribe. The story you are about to hear is rarely explained clearly, and it reveals one of the most fascinating secrets of medieval Europe. This force was not an empire, it was not a kingdom, it was a network, a coalition of merchants who understood something rulers had not yet learned. If you control trade, you don't need to control land. Power will come to you anyway. To understand how this network emerged, we must first forget the romanticized image of medieval Europe. This was not a continent of stable kingdoms and predictable borders. After the collapse of Rome, Northern Europe became a chaotic patchwork of weak states, feudal lords, city rulers, and competing claims layered on top of one another. Borders shifted constantly. Laws changed the moment you crossed a river. Justice depended entirely on who controlled the road you were walking on. For merchants, this world was perilous. Ships faced piracy in the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans were robbed, taxed, or simply seized. Kings were happy to tax trade when it passed through their lands, but were far less interested in guaranteeing its safety beyond their reach. Contracts were meaningless across borders. A deal gone wrong in a foreign city could mean ruin, as there was often no court willing or able to enforce it. And yet, trade continued. Why? Because the profits were astronomical. Northern Europe was rich in exactly the resources the rest of the continent desperately needed: timber for ships and cities, grain to feed growing populations, furs, amber, fish, salt, and wool. Demand was rising, cities were growing, trade routes were forming whether rulers liked it or not. The problem was not demand, the problem was trust. Trust between strangers, trust across languages, laws, and loyalties, trust in a world of violence, corruption, and uncertainty. Merchants were left with a stark choice: remain permanently vulnerable or build their own system of protection. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began cooperating informally. They traveled in convoys, shared ships, and warned each other about hostile ports, corrupt officials, and dangerous waters. What began as a simple survival tactic slowly evolved into strategy. Cooperation reduced risk. Reduced risk lowered costs. Lower costs increased profit. And once merchants realized that collaboration paid better than competition, the logic became impossible to ignore. Cities that welcomed these merchants gained access to goods, capital, and international connections. Cities that did not were left bypassed, left isolated from wealth. Trade routes stopped following geography, they began following trust. Lübeck became a hub linking the Baltic to inland Europe. Hamburg connected river trade to the North Sea. These cities were not powerful because of armies or fortresses. They were powerful because trade could not evolve them. There was no charter, no official founding, no proclamation declaring the birth of the Hanseatic League. It emerged organically, naturally, driven by incentives. Over time, cooperation became expectation. Expectation became rules. Rules became leverage. If a city mistreated Hanseatic merchants, the response was swift. Trade stopped, ships avoided its ports, goods disappeared, prices rose, revenue collapsed. This was power without bloodshed. Economic pressure replaced armies. Denial, exclusion, and collective action became the ultimate tools of enforcement. The League did not replace kings, it made them dependent. Rulers learned that controlling land was meaningless if they could not access grain, timber, salt, and credit. The League also standardized commerce. Contracts, weights, measures, and trading practices were harmonized across dozens of cities, even when they answered to different rulers. A contract signed in Bruges could be understood in Bremen. Prices in Riga could be interpreted in Cologne. The League also established trading enclaves abroad, semi-autonomous commercial districts governed by Hanseatic rules rather than local law. London had the Steel Yard. Bruges and Antwerp hosted major Hanseatic communities. Novgorod became a crucial eastern node. These enclaves were not embassies, they were centers of power. Merchants housed goods, resolved disputes internally, and negotiated collectively with foreign rulers. When cities violated Hanseatic rules, the League responded. Trade stopped, ships were rerouted, supplies vanished. Economic pain was immediate. This was economic warfare without bloodshed, at least most of the time. By the 14th century, the League had grown so confident it could act openly as a political force. When Danish kings threatened Hanseatic interests, the League did not petition higher authorities. It raised fleets, blockaded ports, and negotiated treaties on equal footing with monarchs. A coalition of merchants had bent kings to its will. Yet even at its height, the Hanseatic League never became a state. No capital, no treasury, no unified military command. Its strength came not from centralized power, but from alignment, coordination, and shared understanding. Cities rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, borders shifted, the League adapted, trade routes moved, hubs absorbed shocks. It behaved less like a government and more like a market organism, responsive, pragmatic, and ruthlessly focused on survival. But with growth came conservatism. Rules that once enabled expansion began resisting change. Southern trade routes expanded. Atlantic commerce eclipsed the Baltic. States centralized power, built navies, enforced laws, and issued credit on scales merchants could no longer outmaneuver. The League did not collapse suddenly. It faded, quietly, as incentives shifted and alternatives emerged. The balance between state power and market power slowly recalibrated. The lesson? You do not need armies to wield power. You do not need a crown to influence nations. You do not need ideology when incentives enforce compliance. The Hanseatic League ruled Northern Europe not by decree, but by necessity. And that is often the most enduring form of control there is. If you like this story, like and subscribe.